we're encouraged, I think from very early on as parents, we're encouraged to think about our children's development in terms of behaviour rather than in terms of emotions. So we're always thinking about, how do I stop them doing that behaviour? How do I, they shouldn't be doing that behaviour anymore. They're 7, now they're too old for that. But actually, we're not thinking about what's driving that behaviour. We're not thinking about why is it that they're behaving in this way, in this situation. Instead, we're thinking about how do we change how they behave.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews alongside parents sharing their real-life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking about demand avoidance and low-demand parenting with our expert guest, Dr. Naomi Fisher. Naomi is a clinical psychologist specialising in neurodiversity, trauma and alternative education. She is also the author of several books, with the most recent being When the Naughty Step Makes Things Worse, a parenting guide for parents who find that conventional parenting techniques just don't work for their children, which she wrote along with Eliza Fricker. Since Naomi was a small child, she has asked the world why. Why do things have to be this way, and what would it be like if they were different? Which she applies to education, parenting and clinical psychology. She asks questions like whether the things we all know to be true about parenting are in fact the case. She pushes for new ways to understand difference and to include voices which go unheard. Her work brings psychological theory and evidence-based practice together with real-life clinical experience and open curiosity. The thread that ties her work together is her willingness to take a step outside the conventional and to challenge the status quo, even when others disagree. Welcome aboard, Naomi.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So to begin our conversation, I wanted to express how loved and appreciated you are by the parents of neurodivergent children. I have long admired your amazing work, and I absolutely love your insightful Instagram post, which is how I first came across you.
Oh,
Many of the parents in my ADHD Winchester community are huge fans of your online courses too, and they refer to you as their superstar. And I'd love to share with you the words of one mum who said, Naomi, our son, who is now 11, reached burnout 3 years ago. Since then, you have been our North Star. Your presence alongside us provided the comfort we have so needed. Your guidance is helping to heal our son. When battling the systems with so much worry, your insight gives us confidence. On the darkest days, we have turned to your words for much needed hope. Thank you. Please keep doing what you do.
Oh, that's so lovely. You just disarmed me completely, Claire, at the beginning. It's really, it's just lovely. I find it amazing to hear that people have that experience, because I think that's exactly what I'm hoping to do, because we went through our own tricky times, as many parents do. And I felt like I wished that there was somebody who was kind of like saying, it's going to be okay. You're going to get through this. It's going to get better. It's going to be okay. And at the time, I couldn't find anyone really saying that in the way I needed it said. So that's one of the reasons I do what I do.
Well, thank you, because I think that absolutely sums it up on behalf of many parents. I'm sure that that's exactly what you've managed to achieve. And actually, I completely understand that from a personal level, because in many ways, that's why I started this podcast, because I needed something that didn't exist. So thank you.
That's why we do things, isn't it, really? We're like, where is it? Oh, no one's doing it. I better do it.
I better do it. Exactly. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for continuing to do what you do and for being here to share it with us today. So let's start at the beginning by asking, what is demand avoidance?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because the way I think of demand avoidance is really as a behavioural trait, a way of being, which may have many different causes. So it's basically when a child or an adult has an anxiety-driven need to avoid the demands of everyday life. That's how it would be defined. And pathological demand avoidance is usually thought of as a profile of autism. And although it's not actually an official diagnosis, it's not in the diagnostic manuals. But what I noticed from my clinical practice, because I'm a clinical psychologist, so that means that I actively work with children, adolescents, and parents, and adults actually who aren't always parents, in a therapeutic capacity, so helping with their mental health. And I do work with a lot of autistic young people, but I also work with young people who aren't autistic, and I've worked with many, many adults who aren't autistic and children who aren't autistic. And so I think I often have a bit of a wider perspective than some other people, because I haven't spent all of my career only working with autistic people. And when I started to hear about demand avoidance, and I actually first heard about demand avoidance on Mumsnet about 15 years ago, and I was really intrigued because I have a PhD in autism. I did a PhD, when did I get it? 2002, I got my PhD. And at the time, nobody talked about demand avoidance. It just wasn't a thing. We weren't thinking about it at all. And then when I saw the writing about PDA, about pathological demand avoidance, I was like, wow, this makes such lots of sense for so many people. It describes their children so well. And basically it describes children, I always say, who haven't read the parenting books. So basically, whatever you try and do that the books say should work doesn't work, and in fact backfires on you. So these are the children who, you read the book which says you need to count to 3 to kind of get them to conform. And not only do they not conform, but they start counting to 3 on you. So when you're doing something that they don't like, they're like, Mummy, I'm counting to 1. And you're like, this is not how this is meant to work. How do we get in this position where you're doing, I talked to an increasing number of parents who said, yeah, this is our experience. Lots of them had their children were autistic, but there were also lots of them whose children weren't autistic. And I felt there's something wider going on here. And as a psychologist, I know that behaviours don't really fall. There aren't many behaviours that are only happening in one group of people. Behaviour is something that goes across the whole population. We all have different behaviours at different times. But the other thing about demand avoidance, as I think about it, and I'm sorry, I know this is a bit of a long answer, is that there can be many different reasons why a person might be demand avoidant at a particular time in their life. It's always going to be a combination of what they bring, how they were born, their temperament, their genes, and their environment, what's happening to them. It's always going to be a combination of those two things. And I think, sometimes people talk about, can demand avoidance be as a result of trauma? I think yes, for some children, it definitely can. I have definitely worked with young people who've become demand avoidant as a result of trauma, and for others, it isn't. So it's one of these things where it's really subtle. You need to look at the individual as to what's going on. But the actual kind of trait of demand avoidance is basically the child where the harder you try to put conventional parenting practices into practice, the worse things get, the more the child refuses. So in our book, the new book, the Naughty Step book, which I wrote with Eliza Fricker, we have a cartoon of a parent with a child on the naughty step, and the parents saying, all you need to do is apologise. We've been here for 6 hours. And the child's like, nope. And I think it was born of that kind of feeling of, what do the books never say what to do next? The books never say, so you've been there for several hours. The child is saying, no, I am not complying with what you wanted. What happens next? It's always just kind of keep that firm boundary, push it harder. And what do you do for the children who've got firmer boundaries than you? That's how they're more consistent. And children have got more energy than their parents typically. And they've got, I always used to think about this consistency thing. Parents are told to be consistent, you stick to your boundaries. What about if you've got a child who's more consistent than you, who is says, I'm sorry, no vegetables. That's my line. That's my bottom line. I'm sticking to it. Where do you go with that? And where you go is often horrible conflicts, horrible fights and battles. And I just thought this is a really unhelpful way to help these children. I don't think it's going to help them. And I think we need to do something different. It's a very long answer. Sorry.
No, long answers are great. I think that's an amazing answer because it just paints such a lovely picture and it makes it very real, doesn't it? I think I'm sort of relatively new to demand avoidance, not something I'd experienced with my son, but my daughter who is 9, who recently had an ADHD diagnosis herself, absolutely has some demand avoidance traits. And so I'm really learning to understand this world. And that's my daughter to a T.
Yeah.
In many ways, I want to take my hat off to her because I just think, wow,
it's brilliant,
no one
it?
taught me to assert my boundaries like that. And yet, we still need to go to bed. So it's quite difficult.
Yeah, it's very hard as a parent.
It really is.
Yeah, I agree. I think particularly, and you see these children, you're like, wow, this is awesome that they are so determined. And but at the same time, very, very tricky to parent.
Yes. And you mentioned about it being, for the most part, anxiety induced, if that's the right way to paraphrase what you said.
Well, that anxiety driven, that's the theory. Yes, that's the theory. We don't really know. This is most demand avoidance is, and our understanding of demand avoidance, as I said, is really in very early stages. It was like 20 years ago, no one was talking about it. And there's a hypothesis. In psychology, we talk a lot about hypotheses. So maybe this is why it is. And I think it's a hypothesis that makes sense, that basically the demands of everyday life provoke anxiety. And for some children, that anxiety feels really aversive. They really don't like it, or it feels really strong. And again, we don't really know which of those it might be, but that leads them to avoid, to think, I don't want those horrible feelings. I don't want that. Therefore, I'm going to say no. I'm going to not do this because that's the best way to kind of protect myself. So I think I sometimes talk about that no being a shield. It's like, this is my way to protect myself from these really uncomfortable feelings that come up for me.
So if it's the anxiety that's inducing those uncomfortable feelings and therefore that avoidance, what do you think, from what you know so far, is happening in the nervous system at that time?
So again, there's no research. We don't know what is happening because no one has looked. But I guess the hypothesis would be that they are responding to the demands of everyday life, or maybe that might be their parents saying, it's time for you to go to bed, or put your shoes on, or get dressed, that kind of thing. For them, that feels like a threat. So they're responding as if it's a threat. When our system feels like it's under threat, we have a survival system that comes into play. So we have basic responses. We have fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, kind of going floppy. And so they're responding as if all these things in the outside world are a threat. And the way that they're doing that is either fighting or running away, or just, no, absolutely no way, I'm not doing that, in order to avoid those uncomfortable feelings. But I think what can also happen for a lot of demand avoidant children is that their internal feelings themselves can also start to feel like a threat. So one of the things we know about how anxiety works is that if you are all the time kind of very tuned in to symptoms of anxiety, so if you're all scanning your body all the time, thinking, am I feeling anxious? Are my palms sweating? Is my heart beating fast? You will notice that more, and you will also start to have more of those symptoms, because of course, feeling anxious about being anxious is more anxiety. So you get this kind of snowballing effect. I call it the anxiety multiplier, where you have feelings, then you have anxiety about those feelings, which causes more anxiety. And very quickly you get into this kind of like a hamster wheel. And it's like when people say, oh, my children go from a zero to 100 in a second, I think that's because of the anxiety multipliers, because they feel the feeling and they're like, anxiety about the feeling. And then it's like throwing fire on fire, or throwing paraffin on a fire, where everything just gets worse.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I was just thinking about something you said there in your introduction about obviously behaviours across a population. And we kind of typically think of demand avoidance as being PDA, or pathological demand avoidance, as you said, and often associated with autism. Yet it can also appear in children or people with ADHD. And I read an interesting study, I think it's from 2020, that found that certain ADHD traits, such as emotional regulation, that would be my word for it, I think they called it low emotional stability, and antagonism, which was another thing they referred to as low adherence, can actually be better predictors of demand avoidance. And I thought that was really interesting, because it sort of suggested to me just what you were saying there about the hamster wheel of anxiety, that within ADHD, actually, perhaps the demand avoidance is stemming from the challenges that we're already struggling with at an executive function level, as opposed to just like a need for autonomy. And so I kind of wondered, in your opinion, from your clinical practice and, evidence, how demand avoidance differs, or does it indeed differ, in ADHD versus perhaps those who have an autism diagnosis? Is there a difference?
I think, well, I mean, there's no research that I know of, no robust research which would make sense because it's so new, but also because generally pathological demand avoidance is thought of as a profile of autism. And also because all of these things have fuzzy edges, right? So I'm a psychologist who's, I have spent time in diagnostic clinics diagnosing children with both autism and ADHD. All of these things are a judgment call. When you give a diagnosis, it's not like there's a group of children who walk in through your door and you're like, oh yes, those are the autistic ones. It's more like, each person's a total individual. Where do they fit into any of these criteria? And it really just, the boundaries are much, much more fuzzy than we think they are. So I tend not to spend a lot of time going, this is different for them, this is different for them, because I think things change over time. Like how one child presents when they're 5 could be really different to how they present when they're 10 or 15. But also that just, it's what each individual child brings into the mix. And I think emotion regulation is one of those things that probably goes across not just autism and ADHD, but actually lots of difficulties in childhood, like managing your emotions. I sometimes think it's kind of the key work of childhood, isn't it? Because if you can't manage your emotions, you can't participate in the world in the way that other children are. And if you think about a baby who's born who really has very little capacity to manage their emotions for themselves and relies completely on their parent to do that for them. We all do that for our babies. We rock and we soothe and we coo and all of this kind of thing. And then they go through the toddler stages where it gets more tricky. And again, where emotion regulation is just not something that they are able to do, really. So, they have anything goes wrong, bam, blast, it's all out there. And then we have varying levels of how children learn to regulate their emotions. But we expect by the time they go into nursery and school, we expect them to really be able to do quite a lot of it for themselves. Because if you can't regulate your emotions for yourself, you need an adult, a really attuned adult who is helping you regulate your emotions. And parents do this for their children. But when you go into a school setting, it depends whether there's someone there who can do it for you. And I think quite a lot of children really struggle with that, actually. It's just that they show it in different ways. So some children show it because they get to nursery or school and there's no adult helping them regulate their emotions. And they show that by hitting the other children or by running away, or they go into fight or flight, basically, and that everybody sees. But other children I see just kind of withdraw into their own little cocoon, because they're not getting that help to manage their emotions and they don't know what to do about it. They can't manage it yet because they're not old enough. They're not developed enough, I guess. It's not really about being old enough. It's that I think children develop this capacity at different times and there isn't much flexibility in the system to enable that. And then I think that when this happens, that children's capacity to regulate their emotions is really out of sync with what's being demanded of them in their environment, those emotions can start to feel really scary. And it makes sense that they would, because if you have big emotional responses that nobody's helping you with, then often you'll get into trouble for those emotional responses. There is not the capacity at school to deal with children becoming really angry, for example. It will be seen as behavior and it will be punished. So I think I see quite a lot of children who have learnt that their emotions are really scary and dangerous and that they shouldn't have them. And I think that's a kind of side effect of not getting enough help to regulate those emotions because they seemed a bit older. We accept that 2-year-olds need help to manage their emotions, but we're not so good at accepting that quite a lot of 7 and 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds still need quite a lot of help to regulate their emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that fear probably becomes ingrained in a child, doesn't it? It becomes an inherent part of almost who they think they are, as though they are their emotions because of how they're responded to. And I'm started to think a lot recently, actually, and I'll come back to what you were saying about age there, but how perhaps the challenge is, the word you used was attuned. It's the need for an attuned adult. And I speak for myself in this as much as anybody else. Like, we weren't really given those tools ourselves or given that guidance and support in our own childhood. And I wonder how much of our responses as adults, whether that's as parents in these situations, teachers in a classroom, at a kind of wider level, is almost our own triggers because of how our emotions were responded to, and whether we are automatically, before we're kind of learning otherwise, almost shutting them down through our own fear, our own anxiety.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. But I think it's also the case that we find, I think lots of women in particular, mothers in particular, maybe find some of their emotions quite scary, but they also find their children's emotions scary because children's emotions generally expressed through behavior. And one of the ways we judge a good parent is through their child's behavior. So if you as a mother have spent a lot of your life being good, being well behaved, and then you've suddenly got this child who is absolutely not playing by the rules and is not well behaved, then that judgment comes back on you. And that's very clear often for people at school. I talk to so many parents who say, my child got really dysregulated at school, had a really hard time, and school ring up and say something like, you need to get this behavior under control. And they're like, but they're at school. I can't control their behavior whilst they're at school. I do, and there's this sort of feeling of this is on you. This is back on you. And I've even had parents told things like, you haven't taught them how to behave properly, or just the whole thing is about like layers of shame and guilt. I think people start to feel so ashamed of their child's behavior. And when we feel ashamed, a bit like demand avoidance, we try to avoid that. And we're encouraged, I think from very early on as parents, we're encouraged to think about our children's development in terms of behaviour rather than in terms of emotions. So we're always thinking about, how do I stop them doing that behaviour? How do I, they shouldn't be doing that behaviour anymore. They're 7 now, they're too old for that. But actually we're not thinking about what's driving that behaviour. We're not thinking about why is it that they're behaving in this way in this situation. Instead, we're thinking about how do we change how they behave.
Yeah, what are they communicating through that behaviour? I
Exactly.
took a deep sigh there where you were just speaking, because I felt, gosh, isn't that so true? I know that I have done my worst parenting, for want of a better word, in moments where I felt I was being judged, because it triggered all of those feelings, and it takes a huge amount of work and time to change that in ourselves. But yeah, that really, really resonated with me.
It's awful. I think parenting in the gaze of other people is one of the most difficult, is just the most, whenever I talk to parents who get upset with memories of parenting, it's almost always a memory of trying to do their best and feeling judged by the people around them, even if those people say nothing. Sometimes people do say things which really stick with you for years, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just kind of seeing the gaze or seeing the facial expression and they're all thinking I'm a bad parent.
Yeah, which I guess, as you said, makes us then want to avoid it in our own way.
Of course we do.
Let's just stay at home. Let's not go to the restaurant. Let's not do these things.
Let's just not do it because it can go so wrong. Yeah.
So you were talking then also about age, and I think that's something I'm quite interested in, because obviously children develop all the time. So what impact does age have on demand avoidance? Like, how does it show up in younger children, say, versus teenagers?
So again, it's really individual, and there are many different trajectories. So there are some children I know of who've basically, in younger children, there are some children for whom it's right out there, really obvious, because they are basically they're the change makers. They're the ones who say, no, I am not doing any of this stuff. And I sometimes say they're really good at training their parents early on, because their parents really quickly work out that none of this stuff is working for them and that things aren't going to go in the way that they might have expected. So there you're seeing basically quite a lot of quite extreme behavior. So maybe children who are kicking and punching, children who are very hard to manage around other children. So, that their parents will say, we're always on edge. We just never know when things might just kick off at any moment. And, other parents tell us that we're being helicopter parents or we should just relax. But we know that if we just relax and that moment's gone, then it could go really wrong really quickly. And I think it's when they're younger, it's just the children for whom the kind of standard young child parenting stuff does not work at all. Naughty step doesn't work. Time out doesn't work. Parents will say to me like, yes, so it says time out. They're meant to go into time out for the number of minutes that they're old. They're meant to stay there until they've calmed down. Well, for a start, how do you get a child into time out if that child is refusing to go into time out? Then they say, so I've got the one child in time out who will not stay in time out unless I am there holding them in time out. And now I've got my other children over there who are creating havoc. One parent said to me, they had one child who they were holding, they'd been told they needed to do time in rather than time out until they calmed down. So they were holding this child in time in, and the child was not calming down. And the other child went and got a glass from the kitchen, came out and dropped it on the floor in front of them so that there was broken glass everywhere. And she was like, nowhere in the parenting books did it say, what do I do now? Do I let go of this child who's protesting, who's then going to run into the broken glass? Or do I, what do I do with this? And yes. So I think it's those children who, when you're doing it, you're like, these books just don't apply. Like one of the other things that often says in lots of books, actually, not even parenting books, but books written for parents about stuff to do with children, it'll say things like, have your child do this. I remember reading one book, I think when my children were small, which was about sensory differences, and it had loads and loads of fun activities to do. And it would say, have your child do this, have your child do this. And I was like, how does one have a child do these things?
That's what I was going to say. How?
Yes, exactly. That's the bit you're missing. The book doesn't say. Because what do you do when you say, whatever you suggest to the child says, no, don't think so. Or I've got a better idea. I'm not going to do that. Yes. So anyway, so young children, often that's how it presents. Teenagers, everything gets more complex in teenage years, basically. And I think one of the things that can happen with teenagers is I think there are more teenagers who become demand avoidant for whom perhaps it's more about the environment. So I think that if you think about it kind of as trouble with emotion regulation and needing to avoid really difficult emotions, the more stress you are under, the more likely it is that someone will become demand avoidant. And I say that for pretty well everybody. I've worked in specialist services for adults with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I've worked with people who've been under some of the most intense, it would have been refugees who we had a lot of refugees. We had lots of people who'd been sexually abused as children. We were like a tertiary level service in a London hospital. So kind of, the highest levels of stress that you can imagine really that people had been through. And people who previously had absolutely no difficulty with managing life, you put them under really, really extreme pressure and stress, and lots of them will become highly avoidant of the world. They will become demand avoidant because it's overwhelmed their system. They just can't cope with it anymore. So I give that example because I think I'm saying this is something that actually lots of people will recognize in themselves. I think if you think back over your life, many people are able to think, oh yeah, you know what, when I was, say, doing my finals at university, really high stress time, I actually couldn't cope with any other demands at all. People, they'll say like, I couldn't cope with going out with friends or making a phone call to my mum because even things that were meant to be nice just felt like another thing and I can't cope with that. And so I avoid it. And I think that with teenagers, you've got different groups going on when you think of how teenagers present, demand avoidant teenagers, but quite a lot of young people go into a secondary school, which is very high pressure, very high stress, and they quite quickly start to show demand avoidance. And the way that they show it often, again, there are kind of different ways of going. There are the young people for whom it's about acting out and about loudly saying no. And then there are the ones who completely withdraw. And I think there are more of those as they go towards adolescence. So some of them are still acting out, but quite a lot of them are instead withdrawing and avoiding the world, really, because they're learning that the world is too much and too stressful. And then one of the ways we think about that might be burnout. So yes. Everything starts to connect, really, yes. When you think about it.
It does. It's connecting those dots, isn't it? I was thinking that when you were describing those feelings, it's that being at absolute capacity, isn't it? Like, no, yes, that's my limit. I've reached it. And then, with an ADHD hat on, I would think, well, ADHD is highly environmental. So the way we are maybe in school, for example, is different to how we are at home. So if you then have a teenager whose cognitive load is at absolute capacity and they are genuinely trying their hardest, but it's still not enough, from a classroom or teaching perspective, then I guess you're going to see that behavior, aren't you? They're going to see that avoidance.
Exactly. And I think the thing that people often find confusing is that it can kind of spread across different settings. So so children present very differently in different environments. But when they get to the point of complete overwhelm, I cannot do this anymore, then it's often across environments. So it's often like, they can't manage at school, but they also can't manage at home. Everything just kind of falls apart. And it can often be, parents will say things like, it's like we kind of fell off a cliff. Everything was okay. And then suddenly it wasn't. And now they talk about regression often, which I think is a sort of a loaded term slightly, because I don't think young people I don't think people are losing their skills when that happens. I think what happens is they're just not able to access them.
Yes,
they're not able to do the things. They're still there. They will be able to come back to them. It's not that they've lost them completely, but they aren't able to do it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said previously about that it's just the case you turn to parenting books. So I guess, young child, teenager, whatever you're going through, and the answers are just not there. And that's where low demand parenting comes in. So what is low demand parenting and how can it benefit children with ADHD and children with demand avoidance?
So low demand parenting is very active and involved parenting, but not controlling. So effectively what we're trying to do is to lower the demands. The way I think about it is that for some children, the demands of everyday life bring them into this kind of state of overwhelm that we've been talking about, because everybody reaches their capacity at a different place. And we don't know when we have our child, we don't know where their capacity is going to be. Some children exceed their capacity at nursery school, some don't until they get to 14, some don't until they get to adulthood. But lots of people do exceed their capacity at a particular point. So with low demand parenting, we're trying to reduce the demands of everyday life so that that child is not in overwhelm all the time, because being in overwhelm is not a good place to learn. So basically, if you've got a child who's going through life constantly in a state of only just coping with this, then they haven't got spare capacity to just get better at regulating their emotions, for example. They haven't got spare capacity to develop skills of self-management, the skills that children with ADHD find hard. They haven't got extra capacity because they're all the time operating in survival mode. So what we're trying to do with low demand parenting is bring down that arousal, bring the child back into the window of tolerance, so the window where they're able to manage, where they're able to operate, so that they can learn the skills that they need to learn in order to, hopefully, as adults, manage the skill, be able to manage those demands. So people will sometimes say to me, well, what's going to happen in the real world? When they grow up, no one's going to do this for them. And it's like, yes, that's exactly why we're doing it now. Because actually, if you can help your child to be in that window of tolerance where the demands of everyday life are a bit tricky, but they're not overwhelming, then your child is able to learn. And it's a kind of, I do see a lot of children who are always in this survival mode. And I think it's very hard for them to develop the skills that they need for life in that mode, because the priority of your brain and body at that point is survival, keeping going. It's not the time to read books or even get a good night's sleep or do all the things that, it's about survival.
Yeah. And as you say, we need to almost help them grow up, right? This is the time to help build those skills. So in terms of the window of tolerance, then, what practical strategies can parents use to navigate this? Can we offer low demand parenting?
Okay, so basically, low demand parenting, I think, involves very much the parent thinking, what is important here and what can I change? So the first thing, well, there are lots of things to do, clearly. So I've written lots of books about it. But the main thing to start thinking about is, what are the things that my child experiences as demanding or pressure? I use the term pressure sensitive children a lot. And the reason I use that term is because it's transdiagnostic. So it's not associated with any one diagnosis. So if your child is pressure sensitive, you need to spend a bit of time thinking about, what are the things that they experience as pressure? They might well be things that you as a parent don't think are pressure and don't think your child should think of as pressure. That doesn't matter. It's just about the child's perspective. So you might be thinking, it's very common for parents to say things like, all they need to do is get up in the morning, get themselves dressed and clean their teeth. They're not rocket science. But for a child, that child at this time in their lives, that might feel like a kind of overwhelming mountain. I've got to get up. I've got to get, and I've got to get myself dressed. I've got to brush my teeth, and I've got to do that in order to get to school. That I'm maybe not that. I'm a bit ambivalent about that as well. So why would I want to do that? So it's thinking, what are all the things that my child experiences as pressure, and what can I reduce? Because obviously there are things that we can't just take everything out of our children's lives, and we didn't want to do that either. But often there are things that we can reduce. So, for example, in the mornings, often I'll talk to parents who'll say, I get them up, got their clothes, and then they don't get dressed, so I carry on reminding them. And I'm like, well, for a pressure-sensitive child, each reminder is actually going to be adding to their kind of sense of emotional overwhelm. So you think you're being helpful, but for them, it feels too much the opposite of helpful. It feels more like they're kind of being poked, I think, like poked with an extra, do this, do this, do this, do this. So what could you do to take away that kind of poking mentality, but also think about how can I make it easier for them to get dressed? So it might be having the clothes absolutely ready, and when you get them up, not actually talking about it, but just giving them the clothes. So sort of trying to take out some of the layers of demand. And I'm not going to say that would necessarily work, because it's about the individual child and knowing your child, but it's thinking in those terms. It's basically thinking, how can I make this easier, rather than why aren't they doing it? Or rather than how do I make them do it, is how can I make it as easy as possible for them to do this? Eliza Fricker illustrated the book. She talks about in the mornings before school, trying to think about it a bit like a fireman's pole, having everything ready so the child sort of slides into it. They can almost fall into their clothes. And she said, we just didn't worry about breakfast with breakfast bar on the way because we knew that each of those extra things would actually make it less likely that they would be able to get to school, because there'd be so many demands. And she did this lovely illustration, which is like all the obstacles in your way before you get somewhere. And I think with a child who's really demand avoidant, it's thinking about what are all the obstacles that I'm not even seeing as an adult. I'm not even aware of the fact that getting those clothes on is an obstacle, or maybe opening the door and coming out into the busy house is another obstacle, or coming and sitting at the table and eating. All of those things are actually obstacles. How can I flatten them a bit so that we can make it easier?
Yeah, that's such a lovely I was going to say analogy, but illustration from Eliza, because it really does paint that picture in your mind of all of these stages and steps and the demands that they need, and how if we can smooth that and make it much easier for them to effectively progress through them, the more likely we are to succeed, I guess, together
exactly
on this. And then thinking in relation to school as well, if we can manage through that process and they can go to school less stress, with less anxiety, they're then likely to have a better day.
Exactly. So it's about thinking about where are they. So I've talked about the window of tolerance again. It's like if we can help them stay in that window of tolerance, then they are more likely to have good experiences and to feel successful. And that's really important, because that's where the learning happens. And we know with children with ADHD, for example, we know that they hear a lot of negative things about themselves. We know that they hear more negative things about themselves than other children, which makes sense because of this, what I was talking about, where people respond to behaviour, don't they? So they see the behaviour, they think the answer is to tell the child off. And all of that is going to be, again, pushing that child into a state of overwhelm and feeling under pressure and feeling under threat. And then that can be this kind of back on that hamster wheel. So we're trying to stop the hamster wheel, trying to say, let's just stop right there. And rather than saying, you've got to change, you, the child, you've got to stop behaving that way, we're thinking, how can we make it easier for you to be able to succeed, really, for you to be able to participate?
Yeah, and really reframing that. And I was wondering, I've heard you refer to the kind of connection over compliance, if that's the right phrase. So I'm wondering then, thinking about reframing and about connecting with the child and figuring out what's going on for them, how does prioritising that connection over compliance help our children? Like, what positive changes can we hope to see through that approach? Why is it important, really?
Yeah, so I think a lot of conventional parenting relies on compliance. And we were talking about the shame that parents feel when their children don't comply. We judge parents really by whether their children are under control or not. That's sort of what a good parent should do. And I often say, being under control is a short-term strategy with a person, because you've got a growing person, you've got a child who's going to become an adult. At some point, they are going to need to be in control of their lives. You can't be controlling them for the rest of their life. So compliance is one of these things we really value in early childhood. And as they get older and older and older, it's less and less valuable. And even by the time they get to older teenagers, people will be saying, oh, they're so passive. They don't seem to have any interest in anything. It's like, well, they were kind of trained for that, when we were telling them when they were little, you need to do what you're told. Well, they've taken it on and now they're doing it. And now we're like, come on, what do you want to do? What are you interested in? And it's like we squash that all the way through childhood. So I think part of it is being able to kind of reframe that for ourselves and saying, okay, this non-compliance, this is the spark that we need. And right now it's quite tricky to manage and a bit inconvenient and not necessarily directed in a brilliantly positive direction, but it's still that spark that we need of, this is me, this is what I want to do, and I know what I want to do. But I think that the children who are less compliant, often what happens is that they start to feel disconnected from other people because their non-compliance is met with punishment or met with a kind of conditional approach. So at school, for example, the compliant children are approved of by everybody and everybody knows that. I mean, at school, they make it really visible. There's gold stars, and parents will tell me about behavior apps that they have where, one parent said in their primary school, they had like an app, I think it was something like a monster of, basically how many positive points you have. And it was projected on the whiteboard as the default mode. So you could see every child in the class as to who basically is the good child and who's the not so good child. And children really notice that. From 5 or 6, they're right in there. They know who's good and who's not good, and they know and they know that the teacher treats them differently, that they get disapproval, and they often get disapproval from other children as well, because the other children will also, they're being shown this child is bad. I think psychologically it's such a bad idea. But anyway, so I think they lack the connection, because often with children, we make the connection contingent on the child being compliant. So schools will say things like, well, if they just behaved themselves, then they too could get the awards in assembly, or, we'll be nice to them if they're nice to us. I've even heard people say that. And it's like, you're expecting the child to lead the way here. This isn't going to work. And so I think one of the things I feel most passionately about with low demand parenting is breaking this link between you have to be good before I will be nice to you. And so I think, because particularly for the children, for the autistic children, for the children with ADHD, they need to get the message from us as parents that we are there unconditionally for them, no matter how appalling their behaviour might be. And that's very tricky as a parent, because you're given the message all the time, you can't let them get away with that. You've got to step in. You've got to show them that this is unacceptable. I think most children know that their behavior isn't acceptable, and that when they lose it, for example, and they hit someone, they know that they're not meant to do that because they have been told lots of times, but they have lost it. Just like as parents, sometimes we lose it and we do things that we really regret and wish that we hadn't done, not because we didn't know, but because we're human, and sometimes we just do, we lose it. And I think we need to have that mindset with our children that the most important thing is for them to know, my parents got my back, no matter, they're there for me. And it doesn't have to mean that we're condoning bad behavior. That's what parents often say. If I'm nice to them, doesn't it mean I'm letting them get away with whatever it was? No, because you can say it's not okay to do that, but you don't have to take the next step, which is, now I'm going to make you go and sit in your room by yourself. I'm going to cut off from you. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm still here with you, and I still see you, and I still love you, really, because my love isn't conditional on your behaviour.
Yeah, that example that you gave there, I hear that so many times about classrooms, and it breaks my heart, because I just don't think that teachers realise in that moment, almost the long-term psychological damage that
I don't
has
think they do.
an effect on the wiring of that child's brain. And I really like the phrase reject the behaviour, not the child. It's that we can reinforce that, that we can make better choices, but we are by no means rejecting them. I was talking actually to my son back this week about something a little bit different, but I've always said to him, there's no problem that we cannot solve together. Like, I am 100%, obviously same applies for my daughter, on your team. I have got your back. We can solve this together, and just try to build that bond. So what approaches to communication can we adopt to build those stronger bonds and connections with our children?
So I think one thing is starting where the child is and valuing what they value. So often, I think we're encouraged as parents to try and sort of pull our children through a set of developmental stages, but also to value some things a lot more than other things. So we value the things that they do at school, and we don't value so much the things that they might choose to do themselves. And that's particularly the case if they have a passionate interest in video games, or if they have a passionate interest in Pokemon, or one of these things which children just get really, really into and adults generally cannot see the point in. I think there are quite a few things which, like, for children, are like just all consuming and fascinating, and for adults just absolutely bore them to tears. And I think that when the child sees that we value the things that they value, and it doesn't have to be that you're fascinated by Pokemon, you can just be interested because they are interested in it. That is really connecting. It really helps form that connection with the child. This is one of the things that I do often when I'm doing therapy with a child. The first thing I'll do is find out what their interests are and talk to them about those interests, even if that interest is Minecraft or a video game or a TV program. And I'll sometimes go away and do a bit of research. If I haven't seen the TV program, I'll watch an episode and then we can talk about it. And they are often so surprised. They're like, "Oh, do you know about that?" I'm like, "Oh, yes." And you're showing them that what they are interested in is valuable. And I think often children get the message inadvertently that the things that they are really interested in and they really value aren't important, whereas the things that schools say are important, that's really important. And sometimes parents will spend a lot more of their energy and time in helping their children with the things that maybe they're finding hard at school, like their spelling or their reading or whatever that is, but they won't spend the same amount of time doing the things that child really enjoys with them. So, and I think it's hard to kind of sometimes just put those worries about school aside and say, right now, let's just play Stardew Valley together. Let's just have that time. And this isn't about you. I'm not going to make you read the word. It's like we can get so into this mode where everything is about, I've got to get them to learn it. I'm not going to get you to tell me how many pumpkins will grow if we do this. I'm not going to try and make it about maths or school. Let's just play this game together. Let's just do something that you enjoy. So you can see that, so the child can see that kind of connection where I'm joining you on your terms. And actually, I think there's something particularly powerful about video games. The thing that I think is really powerful about that is that children can often be the expert in a video game. And for children who are finding school hard and they don't feel good at things at school, it's really great to have somewhere where they can feel competent. And typically their parents are less competent than them at the video game. So they get to be, the parents, the newbie, they get to be the expert. And that is so important, I think, particularly for children who are struggling, to have that time where, I'm actually good at this.
That's so true, isn't it? It's such a lovely way of looking at it, because inherently it allows us to switch the roles. Like we become the pupil, we become the person that's learning, and you get to teach us. And when I think about ADHD, like, interest is absolutely fundamentally key to motivation, to concentration, to focus, to everything. So actually you're unlocking so many things, because school is kind of only one part of the equation. And you mentioned video gaming then, and I think that's particularly relevant, because I wanted to touch on screens a little bit and sort of the parenting challenges that we face there in this sense? Because we think about the role of screens. I find even as a parent, there's a demand there, because we're worried the whole time about the contradiction between, like too much, excessive use can be exacerbating or can increase ADHD symptoms. And, we need to reduce that. And yet when I look at, say, my daughter as an example, who does have demand avoidant traits, actually, the way she unplugs from the world is by plugging into her screen with her noise-cancelling headphones on. It's how she decompresses and recharges. Or if I looked at it from my son's perspective, who is, physically always on the go, screen time's about the only way in which his body is still and at rest. So in my world, certainly, there's clearly a balance to be had. And I guess I wanted to ask you what role, therefore, screen time can play in low demand parenting, and how can we kind of intentionally use that to support our children and their emotional regulation, or to reduce the stress, to bring them into the window of tolerance that you mentioned there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the term screen time actually is a very unhelpful one and has led to many parental battles, which haven't been very useful. And the reason why I think that is because I think screen time is this enormous category which we would never use for something else. Like we would never say, oh, I'm concerned my child's spending too much paper time, which we combine reading, drawing, right? Do you know what I mean? We combine all these different activities because they're accessed via a screen. And of course, what's happening is that more and more and more activities are being accessed via a screen because that's the way that the world is going. And then the screen time is this huge, it's kind of a blanket term. And I meet lots of parents who are very focused on screen time. So they'll say, they're only allowed this much time a day. And then I'll ask them, what are they doing in that time? And they'll say, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, there's a real contradiction here between you've got to regulate the time, but actually you're not looking at what is going on in that time. And I kind of flip that around and I say, stop worrying so much about the time, but find out what they're doing. Because I think the whole idea of screen time encourages us to think of everything that a child does on a screen as a kind of has an equal value, is an equal thing. Actually, there are some amazing things that children do on screens, and there are some things which I would absolutely protect them from doing on a screen. And then there are quite a lot of things in the middle. Just to give one example, I suppose, is that lots of children play on tablets and on iPads, and often when I talk to parents, so there's a kind of denigrating that goes on of what they do. They'll say, oh, it's a waste of time. I wish they wouldn't spend so much time on a screen. And then they'll say, oh, well, I won't pay for games. So they just have the free games. And I don't know if you spent any time playing the free games on an iPad, but they are terrible games. They have no gameplay ability because all they want to get you to do is pay money. And they make you do things like watch adverts all the time in order to progress in the game. In fact, and we had a stage when my children were quite small where I've had my own journey with screen time, but I discovered that my son had 27 free games that he'd downloaded onto the iPad, none of which I thought were very good games. So I had a look at them all, and I actually then went and looked for high quality games for people his age based on what I knew he really liked at the time. And I thought, okay, I'm going to make his iPad into a high quality learning environment. I'm going to make it into something so that I know that he's there are some, because there are amazing games. We had a game all about the elements. We had a game about animal biology. We had like all sorts of incredible stuff, but I had to pay for them. But they weren't very expensive. And I thought I would rather invest in him having good games than him be stuck in this world of wanting to be on the iPad, but they're free games and the free games aren't very good. Anyway, so I think we need to shift away from screen time and instead think about what are they doing and what can I help them do more of that is good and that they're enjoying, and what do actually I need to have more of an eye on. And the free games would be one of those. Obviously, there's also stuff about particularly as they get older, what they're accessing and what other people have access to them via social media. That's not quite the same thing as video games. But anyway, sorry, I digress. But I think for demand avoidant children, video games can be a place where they really feel able to take control of the world and to do things, particularly games like Minecraft, which are sandbox games, where they are able to be the person who runs this world. And I think that video games can be a place where children can practice skills that they need in the everyday world, with fewer of the consequences. So one of the things that happens a lot in Minecraft, don't know if you've played Minecraft, is that you die and you lose all your stuff.
Yes.
And it's quite annoying. And everybody gets really frustrated. And sometimes parents will say to me, he gets really, really angry when playing Minecraft. There must be something wrong. And I'm like, this is a chance to practice getting really angry about something when actually, luckily, you haven't actually lost all your stuff. It's pixels and it's going to be okay. It gives you an opportunity for the child to be experiencing something, and you can be right there with them, helping them with it. And they do get really frustrated. They do get really angry, but these things are part of life. And they need, it's like actually another chance to practice doing these things in a situation where no one else is getting hurt, hopefully. And where, even if your house has been burned down, as has happened to many people I know in Minecraft, luckily you will be able to build another house without, and that actually is a really important process, I think, for children to go through. And I often see children, I kind of almost think there are developmental stages of playing a game like Minecraft. Like when they're younger, they can't tolerate things like the house being burnt down. So you have peaceful mode, don't you? And creative mode where nothing bad happens, basically. There are no bad enemies. And then as they get a bit more able to cope, you can up the levels. And then by the time they're older, they're like doing it in survival mode, hardcore, only die once. And it's like you've got the progression built into the game. And with something like Minecraft, you've even got the potential to learn how to code. They've got command blocks where you can code different things. So I do think it's amazing what's built into something like that. And I think valuing what they're doing in that kind of thing, in a game like Minecraft or other games, has such great benefits for the child when they can see that that's valued by those around them.
It's such a good point, because I have been on that Minecraft journey through my son, which started out in creator mode, as you say, and now he's kind of 13 and a half. It's very different. And it's funny, actually, with the way they can move. They can be so immersed in these games, move away from them and actually come back to them as they get older too, which is really nice.
And also this whole thing of, I think some of these games are just places that can meet children at so many different levels, and that's amazing. Like I know of 2-year-olds who've built houses in Minecraft, because it's basically like virtual Lego when you're doing creative, when you're small and you're in creative mode. And then I know of teenagers who are writing mods and who are programming, and it's all within the same game, which is truly amazing. But I think there's something about that. I think there's something about the feeling good about yourself and feeling in control of things, which is really important, particularly for children with ADHD or children who in other contexts are getting lots of messages that you're not doing things well or you're not doing things. I think it's just so important for them to be in a place where they can feel that kind of sense of empowerment. And it can also, in talking about low demand, it can strip away some of the demands, meaning that they can do things that they might not otherwise be able to do. So I know lots of children who find it much easier to socialize in Minecraft, for example, whereas in like real life, socializing is really difficult for them. And they kind of, because they're all of their trouble, maybe their difficulties with impulse control, maybe their difficulties with interpreting emotions of other people, all that kind of thing make it hard. But in Minecraft, you've got you've got a common goal, you're doing the thing together, but also you can still be in your kind of safe zone. And you can also be there with your parent to help you if they can allow that. They don't always allow that, but sometimes they will. And you can be there as the parent to kind of keep an eye on what's going on.
It's such a nice way to look at it, isn't it? How we can positively use screens and these tools to help our children in so many ways. And as you say, kind of reduce the demands at the same time. So what one final piece of advice would you like to leave parents listening who are navigating demand avoidance, and just to help them feel less alone on this journey?
I think the main thing I would say is it's not your fault. And I think the number one thing that's hardest as a parent actually isn't your child's behavior. It's the kind of voice at the back of your head that's going, it's my fault. Nobody else seems to have these problems. Haven't done. Maybe it's just poor parenting, and the sort of tutting and the all of that is what makes day-to-day life so difficult. And also the catastrophizing. I think people often will look at their child's behavior and they'll think, what if they're still doing this in 20 years' time? Then what will it mean? And it's like, you can only work with the child you've got right now, actually. You cannot parent the 26-year-old. You can only parent the 6-year-old. And all of those things can get in the way of you as a parent doing what actually you think is best for your child right now. And most parents are very well attuned to their children, but they have lots of voices telling them that actually they're not attuned and that they've got it wrong and that they should be clamping down or getting them under control and all of those kind of things. And I think if you could just let yourself be in tune with what your child needs and focus on that child and think to yourself, this relationship with this child is actually the most important relationship in their lives and will be one of the most important relationships in your life as a parent. And it's the relationship which you hope is still going to be there in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time when all the other people have fallen away. So, the people that you're now feeling judged by at school, for example, or in the playground, you won't know them in 20 years' time, but you'll still know your child. You will still be with your child. And so building that relationship with them and those connections with them is really parenting for the future. It's planning for the relationship that you would like to have with your child in the future.
Thank you, Naomi. That's such a lovely way to finish, that what we do now has such a positive effect on the future, and just to really focus on that. So thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I've learned so much. As I said, I'm quite new to the demand avoidance journey, and I have no doubt that you will have been a great source of comfort for many people listening, and have offered lots of practical advice and support. And we will, of course, include link to your new book in the show notes, and to your online courses as well, if people would like to find out more about your work. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Claire. It's been really nice to be here.
If you'd like to learn more about demand avoidance and low demand parenting, to sign up for one of Naomi's online courses, or to buy her new book, When the Naughty Step Makes Things Worse, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, then please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.